Friends, welcome. I am so glad that you have chosen to join us tonight for what is our second installment of the Table Talk series. And we have titled this series, Table Talks, Getting to Know Our Muslim Neighbors and Ourselves. And I think you will certainly have that experience tonight. For those of you who got to join us for our last forum 3 weeks ago, we talked about navigating religious pluralism. Tonight, we're going to talk about spirituality and religion. And it is sure to be a rich conversation, just as our last forum was. So glad that you are here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mallory Wyckoff, and I serve as Executive Director of Faith and Culture Center. I've been honored to serve in this role for about a year and a half now, and I've been really excited for this forum series to come together. In case you're not really familiar with the work of Faith and Culture Center, our roots really date back to the firebombing of a local mosque in 2008, just south here of Nashville. And our co-founder and board president, Dawood Aboudiab, was part of that mosque and one of the leaders there on the board. And so really out of the ashes of that experience, a group of folks came together to say, how can we respond here and how can we change the narrative of this experience so that hate and ignorance do not get the last word, but rather this can be a catalyst to bring people together, to reach across divides of religion, race, ethnicity, and culture, bring people together around shared tables and shared conversations to talk about things that really matter, and ultimately build relationships and build greater community in the process. And so that is what we seek to do. Through the Our Muslim Neighbor Initiative, where our programs are currently housed, we're seeking to help people get to know their Muslim neighbors specifically. And so that is part of everything we do, and certainly part of this forum series as well. I am thrilled that we were able to have this forum series. It's been challenging when central to everything that Faith and Culture Center does is designed to bring people together, as I said, around shared tables and conversations. And COVID has made that tremendously difficult. And so I'm grateful that this series is a way for us to kind of bring our table to you, to the community, and to invite you to pull up a seat, if you will, and join us here for these conversations. So I'm really grateful we still get a chance to connect. And I'm thrilled for the group of panelists that we have assembled tonight. I'm going to just briefly introduce them to you, and then we will move forward with the conversation in just a moment here. So first, Dr. Assam Ido. He is Senior Lecturer of Islamic Studies and Arabic at the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University. So we are honored to get to have him serve here locally in town. He formerly served at Chicago Divinity School and their Islamic Studies and Arabic programs. Prior to the Syrian uprising, he taught at the University of Damascus. He is from Aleppo, and he and his family left there and came to the United States, and he's been serving as a professor here since then. His research focuses on questions of authenticity and the shaping of authoritative Islamic texts among Muslim scholars. And we are also honored that he gets to serve as one of FCC's board members. So I'm thrilled you'll get to hear from him and learn more from him tonight and his immense experience. I'm also thrilled to get to introduce Rabbi Shana Goldstein-Mackler, who has joined Faith and Culture Center for programs prior to tonight, and so glad that she's here again. She has served as a rabbi at the Temple Congregation Ohabai Shalom here in Nashville since she was ordained from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati back in 2004. And so that is quite a long time to be serving at one congregation. So kudos to you, Shana, in that regard. What she does is combine her love of Judaism with her passion for education, social justice, and interfaith work. And that shows up in the work she does as a rabbi, in the ways that she serves on various boards here in town, the educational work that she's been part of. And she and her husband, James, have 2 children and live here in Nashville. So welcome, Shana. So glad we will get to hear from you tonight. And then lastly, we get to hear from Dr. Josh Graves. He is also one of FCC's board members. He is lead minister for the Otter Creek Church here in Nashville. If you all were at our Faith Over Fear conference earlier this year, they're the folks who hosted us for that conference, which we're so grateful for. So he has served there for over 10 years now, author of 3 books, and has 3 boys with his wife, Cara. And we're so glad that he's joining us here as well. So Assam, Josh, Shana, thank you for being here and being on our panel. So without further ado, let's dive in. One of my favorite authors and preachers and human beings, her name is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she writes in her book, Altering the World, quote, "If I had $1 for every time I heard someone say, I am spiritual but not religious, then I might not be any wiser about what that means, but I would be richer. And my sense is that many of us have heard that identifier before, right? That folks have said, well, I'm spiritual, but not really religious. And so I'm curious for you, knowing that particularly that the number of people who identify with that concept continues to increase. What is your sense of what people mean when they say that? When you hear people say, well, I'm spiritual, but it's disconnected from the sense of religion. What's your sense of what they mean and might be behind that?
I'll jump in on that. I think what people mean is that there is a sense of seeking and trying to make meaning in life without necessarily conforming to the religion of their parents, a set of principles or dogmas or behaviors that have been passed down to them. It's sort of a way of expressing their religious independence, sort of like our political independence, neither belonging to either party, but wanting to still have a sense of the sacred and making meaning in the world that we have. So that, for me, that's what I hear when people are saying they're spiritual and not religious, means that they are not, for whatever reason, and there are many, many reasons, institutional religion doesn't appeal to them or doesn't seem to fulfill their needs, or they're skeptical or cynical, and in some cases with good reason, of that institutionalized, formalized religion. This is much more of a seeking rather than a dwelling in a practice.
Thanks, Shana. Josh and Assam, what would you add to that?
I would, so I'm going to give two interpretations. The first interpretation is cynical, and the second one is hopeful. The cynical interpretation is, it's a very Western, individualistic way of saying, I want to be open to the idea that there's more out there in the world. There's a sacred realm, a sacred nature to our existence. But I don't want all the hassle of tithing and having to go to church and or mosque or synagogue, whatever it is. And I don't want all the extra stuff. So in a sense, there's a real laziness to it, which I think is where Reverend Taylor is talking about. I also think there's a very hopeful element to it, and that is, I think it's the difference of just going to Publix and buying bottled water, religious, versus I want to go to the top of the mountain and I want to drink the pure source at the top of the mountain. And I think that's what we've seen since the 1950s, 1960s, if you want to call it after-modern or hyper-modern or post-modern. We can debate that in a different time. But I think that's what people are saying in the rejections of institutions, or at least calling for reform of institutions, is to say, you guys are selling us water by the river, and we don't want to buy the water anymore. Like it was never yours to sell anymore. We want the pure source. I think the good news for the three religions represented right now, and I would add Baha'i to this too, is that's a commonality that we all share, is bringing people back to the true essence of what we mean when we say God, when we say that God reveals God's self in the world, that God is moving, that God is acting. That's what people are hungry for. It's what they're thirsty for. So yeah, I think both of those ways of interpreting are fair. I want to end, or at least land, on the hopeful interpretation.
Yes, I completely agree with these two statements by Shana and Joshua, especially about hopeful. So there is a statement among Sufi people, and just let me introduce how Muslims understand spirituality. So because like we have here, like I'm spiritual but not religious. So what's the definition for like spiritual here, and why like some people say I'm spiritual but not religious? So mostly in my region, and people like mostly define spirituality as tasawwuf or Sufism, and Sufism means purification. So I did not hear like someone say like I'm Sufi, like here like spiritual. So mostly like people saying I'm a seeker for that target. So this like the word used in Arabic salik. Salik, that means not the one who reach the top of mountain. So I'm just a seeker. I'm in the quest for that target. So and I think that, but meanwhile, so when people like use that in Sufism, so there is a very important fact in Sufism that the ways to God are infinite. So that's based on the number of people in this earth. So if we have millions, if we have millions of millions, then we have millions of millions ways to God. So that's why all people like they want to seek, and they have their own quest to that spring, and that's the yearning. I think that is the yearning, because human, when created on this earth, is created to be in two worlds, physic and metaphysic. So then when human decide like to go with like I'm spiritual, because they this like a yearning, longing to that world. So we are stuck in this world. We are stuck in physical world, but we have everything around us every day call us to that world, to the metaphysic. So that's why I think, so this like just like an aspect of yearning, an aspect of longing to that world.
So a couple key words that you've highlighted there that I heard each of you reflect on, this idea of yearning and seeking and longing and pursuing. And so for each of you in your respective spiritual journeys, those have thus far led you to the respective traditions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And so I'd love, and maybe I'll start with Islam, and maybe we can work our way backwards, but would you kind of share what's maybe the history and tradition of spirituality within each of your respective faiths? Because as we said, obviously for many people, spirituality is separate from religion, and for various reasons. But for many people, spirituality and religion are inherently linked. And so I'm curious for you all, as you have, as I said, pursued your own seeking, longing, yearning, and those senses of search, and they have led you to your respective traditions. What have you found about the spirituality within each of those traditions, their history, and perhaps their core, their central features? Islam, can we start with you?
So yeah, so the spirituality in Islam starts from a very important text that's adopted by Judaism and Christianity. And this text, Maimonides especially talk about this text, and especially among Sufi, the text that Allah and God created Adam on his image, like same as his image. So then, when you speak about Sufism and spirituality, you speak about manifestation of God through different shapes and through this world. And the perfect manifestation of God in this world are prophets. But prophets, they have different manifestations. So Adam, for Sufi, is Muhammad, and Adam is Jesus, and Adam is Moses. So all of these people are same, but different manifestation. So then these are for Sufi people, for spiritual, are just models, are ideal people for others. So just like a hope for others to have same. But the difference between prophet and saint, that means the prophet is just restrict or just like he needs to follow the teachings. He does not have any free path out of the teaching. But saint, they have this free will. So that's why everyone has his own path to God. So, but this like could be like in different ways and different shapes, but everything starts from that text. God created Adam based on his image, or according to his image. And then according to his, referring to what? Referring to his epithets, or referring to his essence, or referring to what? And this, I think, the most important text we Muslims start from.
Thanks, Isam. Josh.
Yeah, so I guess we're all going to just steal Shayna's text. So we're going to do Genesis. And we Christians are really good at we're really good at that. Shayna, let us tell you what Genesis says. I'm just kidding. But yes, no, this is exactly right. Even in the impression I get with the word spirituality is spirit. There's a freedom, there's a vitality, there's a life, there's an energy to that word, right? Where religion, I mean, the word is shrill, it's cold, it's kind of the opposite of life. And it does, in our sacred texts, which are all in conversation with each other, it certainly begins with Genesis. When you read Genesis up against other ancient creation narratives, two that come to mind are the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic. What the Genesis text says about God and how God has interacted with humanity is very different than the other creation narratives. And probably the biggest point of difference is that God has put God's spirit in every human, and that we bear the sacred name of God literally on our bodies, that word, the word for God that cannot be spoken. So you talk about an audacious claim to the beginning of a story. Like, I don't know a story out there that makes a bigger claim than Genesis 1. And so by the time you get to Jesus, in my tradition, in my faith, he says things like the wind, which is the same word for spirit or breath. He says the wind blows where it will. You don't know where it comes from or where it's going, but that doesn't make it any less real. And so in Christianity, you have this interesting connection to Sufism, and it's not exactly the same, but Christians have this long stream of mysticism, and that word makes a lot of Christians nervous for one major reason. They just haven't read really about the mystic tradition. But the mystic tradition in Christianity is basically wake up. Like, wake up to your life. Wake up to the brilliance that is every moment of the thunder that I can hear rolling in the clouds right now, of the hydrangeas that you can't see that are behind the light. Like, every moment is packed with the mystery of the divine. And so, for Christians, we would say Jesus is the original mystic. He's the best mystic. We could debate whether he really is the original or the best. But that's certainly where our faith would start, is to say it is about being alive and awake to the mystery of your own existence.
Shayna.
I think you did a good job with our text. Well done. I do think, it's the pun is in the beginning. It does go back to that beginning of what we understand to be the beginning of human consciousness, let's say, and the creation of the world as told through our text. And that idea that the spirit is just like the wind, it is breathed into humanity. And I think our existence allows us that goal of trying to reconnect with the divine. So that is really that yearning is reconnecting with the divine, but also knowing at the same time, perhaps as a paradox, that everything is the divine. Everything is God. If God is one, then God is all, right? And so that is not just for Jews, that's for all of humanity. It's for our world. And I think that if we go in that direction and understand the transcendent God is also the immanent God, right? It's the same. That's that spiritual quest. I think that is really the beginning of all of it. And the disassociation, the removal of ourselves from that relationship, that intimate relationship with God, either by our own acts or, by the expulsion from Eden, or however you want to look at it, that constant striving to reconnect is that spiritual journey. We have our own brand of mystics that had existed throughout our history, looking at those hidden messages and the hidden wisdom. How do we get back there? How do we reconnect in a personal way? Whether it's the mystics in the early turn of the millennia, or if it's in the 16th century in Sfat, the Kabbalists, the one that study the Kabbalah. Really, it's to seek how do we get that sense of the Pardes, that paradise, that connection back with God. So I do believe also that really the beginning is the history of our text really starts with the breath of life. and having a sense of the relationship with the divine and trying to navigate and respond to the world in order to maintain that connection.
Thank you. One of the things I'm really hearing each of you say is that in general, but then also specifically in your traditions, that spirituality is not about attaining something that you do not have, but it's starting with the sense that this is who I have been created to be, that is bearing the image of God, somehow possessing the very spirit of God and dwelling in me, and seeking to understand, live that out more, be more aware of that, live into that, reflect that more and more in the world. Not the striving for something, but maybe the ever deepening awareness of what that truth already is. Does that feel fitting to your traditions and how you understand spirituality?
Yeah, when you were describing that, I was thinking of that great line from Frederick Buechner. He says, "This is your life. Good and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. You might not have ever been, but you are. And the party wouldn't be the same without you." And I love that idea that if we are to love God and to love people as Jesus built on the Torah or took from the Torah, then it starts truly with loving yourself. And I know in Protestant traditions, it sounds really touchy-feely. I've had people say that sounds too new agey for me. But if you go back to Genesis 1, and God has put God's image in every person who's ever walked planet Earth, then we have to take seriously what it means to be able to look in the mirror and to say, I am worthy of loving myself just as much as I am called to love other people. And that's really the beginning point. The healthiest people I know have a very healthy level of self-love. And the most toxic people I know, it starts because they don't know how to love themselves.
Yes, right. So I think the journey starts from from this question. So whom should be defined, God or human, to open that journey for spirituality or Sufism, mysticism, or Kabbalah, or all of these? So in Sufism, they answer this question: human should be defined, not God. So why? Because the first step, there is a very important text among Sufism, and especially from Andalusian Sufi Shaykh, scholar Ibn Arabi, the great Shaykh in the history of Islam. And he called this hadith a statement from Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and said, just like narrating to God, and God said, I was a hidden treasure. And then I love to be known. And because of that, I created a human. And through human, I'll be defined and I be known. So then we are, so I will make this analogy. So by eyes, we see. And by human, God seen. So then we have two eyes in this world. So this eyes that we have here, and we see through it, and we are another eye for God. And then how we can understand this reality? So we are the carrier of the essence. And as much as we are transparent, the essence would be clear. And as much as we are aware of that essence, the divinity, Allah, God, then this treasure will be known. So we need to be defined. So that's why. So when human go far from this reality, so this reality that a human created to be in two worlds, and to have consciousness about that world, about metaphysics. And once a human be far from that reality and stuck in this world, and just I'm living in this world. So everything coming with this doctrine, like just like living in this world, so would be fake happiness. So this to shrink the human reality. So we are created to be in two worlds. And once we are aware of that, so then we'll be defined. And once we will be defined, so God will be defined. And God will be seen through us.
Thank you. Shana, anything you'd want to add to any of that?
Well, I think when we continue our conversation, I think parts of that will unfold as well. I think the beginning with that divine spark that is in each human being really allows us to not only focus inward, but also focus outward, to respect each other's spiritual paths, I guess. And I think the idea of the mystics, and throughout history, the mystics have actually been able to get along sometimes better than the organized religion, those power brokers in organized religion, because I think they also saw in one another and respected in each other that idea of the transcendent nature, that shared wisdom, that there's more than what we know, and the humility to be able to say that and to experience it. So, I mean, I hear so much in what you're saying, Isam, that resonates with what our mystical tradition also puts forth, that is shared. You know, the idea that religion is sort of the house for the spirit, just like the human body is the house for the soul. And so, you know, if you think of a tree and sap, they need each other in order to continue. But you can't really have one without the other, or it doesn't exist for very long. So I see that there's a play that's happening, you know, where we have to embrace the spirits, just like pay attention to the soul inside of our bodies. When we focus only on one of the two, that we have I think a more serious issue at hand, just like you were saying, Joshua, with the self-love, and the people that can focus on that are some of the healthiest people you know.
So each of you has used the language of mystics, and just in case there are folks joining us who that language is less familiar, I want to invite each of you to share about maybe some of the key figures within your spiritual traditions, those of your faith. What are some of those key mystical figures, and the figures who are the mystics, and then maybe some of these mystical experiences that they've had that have been most significant to your religion, but also to your own sense of faith. Maybe these particular stories that you have been formed by and that have continued to be very compelling for you. So what are some of those key figures in your faith? And maybe in that we'll get an even clearer sense of this language of mysticism and what that really means. Josh, you want to start?
There's an interesting debate that I've been part of in Christian circles with theologians and philosophers about the idea that every Christian should be a mystic. So it shouldn't even be like, well, within Christianity, we have our mystics over here. And the people who would argue for that position would say that mysticism is not meant to be a private club. It's not meant to be secret. It's not meant to be mysterious in that sense. It simply is a daily commitment to seeing God in everything, to seeing God in all things. So in that sense, Christianity fits very nicely within panentheism, not pantheism, but panentheism, meaning God is in all things. God is not all things, right? But God can be seen in everything. And so, in the strictly Christian sense, you're hard pressed to find anybody who's done anything significant in Christian history who wasn't a mystic at some level. From Jesus to Mother Teresa, from Dr. King to Julian of Norwich, St. John of the Cross, to the women who pushed for voting rights in the United States. Like at some level, the significant Christians who did significant public work, Thomas Merton, connected to this deeper sense of seeing God in washing the dishes and seeing God in the March on Washington in the Civil Rights Movement. So I think I lean towards, if you take Jesus seriously about being awake to the kingdom of God, so the goal of the mystic is not to be like super spiritual, The goal of the mystic is to see the kingdom of God and participate in it. And so if that's the definition, then we've got billions of Christians who would emulate that.
Assam?
Okay, I'll jump in since you called me. So for me, it's, let me go deeply with Islamic heritage, and I'll pick one figure, even though there are many figures in the history of Islam in Persia, in Andalus, in North Africa, Africa, and all places, because Sufism was a big fact in the history of Islam. And mostly right now, all discussion about Islam, like maybe does not give a very good attention for that. But here in Western academia, thanks God, so we have a very good discussion about that. So, however, I think the most important figure for me is Fariduddin al-Attar. This a Persian Sufi scholar in the medieval time. And he wrote a very important book called The Conference of Birds. And this is a journey for birds going in quest for understanding the reality of this world and the reality of their Lord. And they're led by a bird. He has just like a wisdom and he has guidance. So, and there were like millions of birds and different bears, different types of birds, but every bird has a different desire, has a different goal, has a different quest. So, and he said to them, if you want to reach that target, you need to meet the Simorg. And Simorg is a word for their Lord. So they don't understand exactly what the Simorg is, but just, okay, Simorg is a word and we need to meet that Lord. So, and he said to them, we have 7 valleys we need to pass and to struggle with these 7 valleys, and we need to think about desires and what's our objective from this journey. And once they start the journey, so their number reduced gradually, and by each valley. And each valley is a very huge step in that quest. So like one of these valleys are real knowledge, and another valley is a real poverty. It's just like to remove your egoism and to have no will, and there's no will for you and no desire. So, but some birds stuck with beauty, and some birds stuck with rivers, some birds stuck with like different aspect of that life. And in the end, 30 birds reach that mountain, just 30 birds. And they ask their leader, so where is the Simorg? And the Simorg in Persian language mean 30 birds or 31. And he said to them, you are the Simorg. So you are the Simorg because after finishing this journey, this like the real reality, as I said first. So God will be defined through us, and God created a human just like to be seen through humanity. So I try to use that text, Conference of Bird, when I came to Nashville, and that's a good work with Nashville Ballet here. And we made a very great show in downtown with Nashville Ballet, and a story about Layla and Majnun, and about a story of love, and how is the lover elevate in a journey to reach a moment, or to reach a stage that's love for love and not for egoism or for just like for himself, and just like to engage in that love. So this is a very important text. I'm sorry to be late, but just like to introduce you to a very important text that translated into English. And I think many of you maybe read that text or aware of that text.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to be sure I heard it correctly. Did you say it's the Conference of the Birds? Is that right?
Right.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Sam. Gina.
Like the other traditions, we have a tremendous history of different mystics throughout. But if we were to look back early in our text and into the Hebrew Bible, just those who have relationship with God, you might consider what we consider the mystics. When you're thinking about Jacob's ladder, right? Having that divine dream or wrestling with the angel and like Josh said, knowing God was in that place and not recognizing it before, right? Having those moments when you realize that everything is has the potential to be godly. So I think those early patriarchs and experiences can be deemed spiritual or mystical, as well as Moses at the burning bush or the theophany at Sinai, having those experiences. And what strikes me about those, particularly with Sinai and with the burning bush, is that we don't know exactly where they are. Right? There's not a shrine built to them. We know the Sinai Peninsula, but we don't really know which mountain was Sinai. And the rabbis go through extensive conversation about which mountain was it, the most exalted mountain in the area or the lowliest. We don't know what kind of tree the burning bush was. And so the idea that it can be ordinary and finding the sacred in the ordinary is really what I think those early mystics, spiritual leaders, were teaching us, that it doesn't have to be something, magical or majestic in that way. That changes a little bit when you get to Ezekiel, in some of those images, clearly with the chariot and dry bones and the rest. But I think that we've got that sense that everyday spirituality, everyday mysticism happens all around us, and you have to be aware because one of the rabbis said the most important thing about the bush burning was that it wasn't being consumed and someone stopped to notice, right? Moses stopped to notice that burning bush was burning, but not being consumed. And so to take the time to pay attention to that really has a different sense of spirituality or a different sense of awareness in the world. I think if you were to go through, from the 1st and 2nd century of this Common Era, through the Middle Ages and around the 16th century spot, like Isaac Luria, there are so many names that we can bring up for people that really brought defined mysticism, opened up a path for lots of different people to seek the truth. And much of it is done through text and through that textual study. There are great stories about the 4 who entered into paradise, and some people couldn't take it. One of the 4 couldn't take it. One went mad, really, with all of the different exposure, I guess, to those truths that are there. One turned away from the faith altogether, and one came out and was unharmed, but was much more spiritually whole. Right, that's the story. So I think that it was probably served as a little bit of a warning about going down that proverbial rabbit hole. For some of those mystics, but it also showed that it wasn't for everybody. It's open to everybody, but it wasn't always for everybody.
Yeah, I would just add how the Second Testament or the Christian text is such a continuation of everything that you see in the Torah. With Jesus and his baptism, he has this transcendent mystical experience. But then his life gets really hard afterwards. So it's not like he's this super spiritual person that just hovers or floats around. He's taken by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted after he's had this mystical, life-changing encounter. I think what the mystics in Scripture and the mystics in history have in common is a real sense of being okay with being weird and odd, like almost an embrace of the odd and as a badge of honor. I'm thinking of St. Francis of Assisi now, preaching to the birds and leaving wealth and privilege. I also think that in our traditions that mysticism is much more comfortable with suffering than, say, an average American would be. That suffering can actually be beautiful. It can purify you it can expose all these extra idols in your life that maybe you didn't know existed. So these women and men have a tremendous amount to teach us.
Yes, that's. Let me just jump in, Mallory, and comment on this beautiful statement by Shaina and Joshua. I think the suffering starts from the step or from the moment that you are exposed and aware of that reality. So that's the all stories of prophets. So their trial start from that moment. But this moment also was opened for a real freedom. So this like the real happiness. So it's a big suffering, but also the real happiness. Because once a human are aware, or once a human is aware of this reality, he understands the suffering and he encounter for that suffering, but also this a very important announcement for freedom. Because the freedom, this like is a real freedom to discover there is no control over his body, over his spirit, over his reality, over his world, except that reality. And all over his desires, over his ego. And then his body will become a container for that reality. And no one can control him. And no one can drag him. That's why I think the spirit and the strength of prophet, and they change the history because they just stuck and they just like were aware of that moment. And then they change the history and change the world.
So one of the things I hear each of you highlighting is the sense of spirituality as paying attention to what is really real and true in a moment. So sometimes it is in a very ordinary experience. Sometimes it is what is considered this extraordinary or otherworldly, or more transcendent experience. And it could be in washing the dishes, as Josh said. But the sense of being open to and paying attention to the really real, which for me, in my own sense of spirituality, is even one of the ways that I name God, is the really real, and these encounters with the really real in the everydayness, and sometimes the moments that you least expect. So this idea of everyday mysticism, I think you use that language, Shayna. I'm curious for each of you, where are those seemingly routine, ordinary realities of life that are more than just the particulars in front of you, but that there's a sense of the really real present, the sense of the divine, what is most sacred and true, that is present with you in that moment, even in all of its ordinary form? What have been some of those spaces that maybe are routinely that way for you, or maybe one-off experience that's been really significant for you in your own spiritual journeys?
I think for me, it goes along with our understanding of creating sacred space and creating sacred time. To pay attention to those moments, to just stop and, look at your family in a different way, or, pay attention to, my grandfather once said, have you ever noticed how many colors of green there are outside? Looking at all the different shades of green, just stopping and appreciating those little moments. And a lot of that for me has to be doesn't have to be, but is in nature. The other tradition that I love that we have in Judaism is to say 100 blessings every day, which is hard, right? It's hard to find 100 different, blessings. So we have a lot of prayer services that can accomplish that, knowing that one of our prayers actually has 18 prayers in it. So you can sort of check them off for the 100. But what it really means is that you're paying attention to a rainbow, and there's a certain blessing for that, or to see a body of water, or anytime you eat a specific kind of food. It really is that mindfulness. And I think that's where that everyday spirituality can come in. I think, we'll call it different things today. And I'm not saying that all of our congregants would do this. This is not necessarily a lived practice necessarily in the Reform movement, but the intentionality and the mindfulness behind each and every action whether it's washing your hands or, you know, everything can have a blessing. And so, but just that simple act of blessing puts you into the world, right? Puts you into that space, paying attention to what you eat, what you say, what you're reading, what you see outside. I think those kinds of moments really allow for that practice of everyday spirituality for me.
Josh?
I'm going to defy the Vegas odds, and I'm going to connect professional basketball to this conversation. So I've been very fortunate the last 4 months to work with several professional basketball players who happen to live in Nashville during the off season. And one young man in particular is just finished his first year of playing at the highest level in the NBA. This young man has incredible potential. And we've been talking a lot about the paradox of being human. Our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. What makes us great is what makes us terrible. And he asked me recently, we were having breakfast, and he said, I'm really having a hard time controlling my emotions. And we talked about how anger is really just fear masked, especially for men. Anger is really about fear. What am I losing, or what am I not measuring up to? And I just asked him a simple question that I didn't even think would lead anywhere significant, but it led to a very mystic conversation. And I said to him, I said, when you get upset in your craft, and this is true whether you're an accountant or a violinist or whatever, I said, but when you get upset on the court, what do you do? And he said, I walk away. And I said, I want you to try something else next time. Have you ever paid attention to your breathing? He was like, what are you talking? He's like, actually what he said was, are you some kind of Buddhist? I was like, you actually could use some Buddhist practice in your life. And it led to this conversation. The most watched television program of the spring during the quarantine, after Tiger King, which is what Mallory thought I was going to say, is a documentary about Michael Jordan. And this was the comment that several of his teammates noted about him. And this was the payoff of the whole experience. All of his teammates said they've never played with an athlete who had the ability to be fully present in the moment every single day of his professional life. He was not obsessed with the past. He was not consumed with the future. He had the ability to block everything out and to see clearly what was at stake in every practice, every session, every training, every film study. And I really think that that's part of what made Jesus so unique. He was not scrolling on his phone, right? He did not give to anxiety as far as we could tell. He was fully present with people. He was with them. He saw them. He looked into their soul. And I think when you go the mystic path and you commit to the disciplines that mystics have taught us over the years, and there are many ways to develop that, but you develop this muscle, you develop this ability to have peace in every situation and to be content because you are fully consumed with what's happening in the moment. Even right now, as we're doing a Zoom call, knowing there's text waiting for us and children who have to be put to bed. I think that is such a special part of being human.
Yes. So, I think the idea for like maybe the sacred or best moment or best time, best place. So I believe based on the Sufi literature, every moment is sacred. But how that would be sacred? So once you open your eyes and you are aware of that reality, then every moment will be sacred. But everything coming from prayer, and prayer in Islam means salah, and salah has two meanings. The first one, connectedness, and the second one is melting. So these two meanings are very important. So to melt what, and what is the things that should be melt? Like ego or your identity or what. And everything, the essence of salah coming when you put when you put your head on the ground, because all faculties, all human faculties, vision, hearing, and reasoning, everything here. And then when the human puts his head on the ground, this is the sacred moment. But that's not should be like a practice just like in public. So, but how is this like happening? So Sufi understands that. So there should be a balance between the inner and outer. And if the inner and outer are same, so then everything will be fixed. Should be the same, but also according to God's will. So once a human train himself to do that during his inner, during his inside, inward, in secret places, in his privacy, so where no one can access to him or see him, so then he is a master of his public life. So the idea starts from how you train yourself. This is the idea about like when you speak about Sharia and Haqiqa. So Sharia and Haqiqa are very important words for Sufism. Because the idea here is Sharia is to apply the laws on yourself, not on others. Not to implement these regulations on others, but on yourself. And the idea of haqiqah and reality is to be merciful towards others. So then this is the opposite of like mostly like what we see right now. So how you can be strict with yourself and how you can see excuse for others. So I went so far, but let me go back to the idea of the prayer is a sacred moment. But once you are aware of that one, so then every moment will be sacred and every moment will be beautiful, rich, and carry happiness.
By the way, Shane, when Isam was talking, I was thinking of Daniel. Like he just described Daniel beautifully in those first 6 chapters.
Exactly what went, especially just the idea of how Muslims pray, and the phrase in Hebrew is like to fall on your face, right? That's the idea. You know, it's not that everyone was clumsy. It was that same sort of sense of humility and groundedness, and paying attention. You know, we genuflect, we just don't go all the way anymore, I should say. But the idea of making the ordinary extraordinary, you know, by bringing a sense of the sacred to it, really, that is a practice, right? And it's so easy to be distracted that it's constantly something you have to work on. And I think that play between religion and spirituality, that's where the rubber hits the road. You know, that's, I think, where each of our traditions offers a way to do that, a way to bring the spirit alive, you know, so that it isn't that selfish, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, but that self-centered path to connect with the divine, but a way that you're rooted in something so that you can then find yourself elevated without taking off, right? You're still grounded in the earth, but you're able to see the spirit differently. One of the most profoundly spiritual moments I had was actually in nature, and it has a mountain involved, which is very Jewish, you know, in my world. But we hiked a 14,000 foot mountain in Colorado, and we were sleeping just below the tree line. Thank goodness. There was a big storm that was coming, and if you're below the tree line, you're more protected. And I'm from Florida, and I'm used to hearing thunder that's super loud and storms. And I heard the loudest thunder I had ever heard in my entire life, so much that it was inside of my body. I could feel the reverberation. And I had a moment recognizing what people felt when they heard the thunder, as it were, at Sinai, right? Just this total vulnerability, that exposure, and feeling it in your soul, you know, this powerful force of nature. And for the first time, I think I really appreciated that fear and that awe and the vulnerability that is told in that story, being ready to accept something bigger, you know, something more profound in that moment. So that, I think, paying attention to those kinds of moments and recognizing that they exist. It doesn't have to be something as grand as that, but there's a true sense of awe that exists there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Briefly, I'll name that for me, what has become a sacred practice and a spiritual practice is changing diapers. There's even a liturgy that I will read often, this liturgy for changing diapers, because for the last few years, I have changed many a diaper. And finding this to, rather than be a chore or something that prevents me or inhibits me from the experience of the divine, rather that this is a vehicle for it. And sensing the sacred in the lives and the bodies even of my children and how I care for them. And I was reading recently a young mother who was sort of lamenting to her spiritual director that, I try to wake up early and have these intentional prayer practices and times to sit down and be very, very intentional, right, with my spiritual practices. And then inevitably one of the babies wakes up early or something goes wrong with them. And I just can never seem to have these habits that I really, spiritual habits and practices that I want and I'm trying to pursue. And very wisely, the director said something to the effect of, what if God so longs to be connected with you and engaged with you and even held by you that God simply can't wait? And so God rushes into the bodies of your children and wakes them up so that God would have the experience of being held by you in the ways that you hold your children. There's not a more beautiful story or way to me to think about this, what might otherwise feel like an interference at times to your spirituality, all the things that could get in the way, something like having to change diapers in the morning, but rather, what does it look like to be fully awake, present here to the sacred and the divine that is with us? So I'm going to ask you all one more question, and I'm going to open it up to everyone who's joining to ask their questions and share their comments. You shared briefly about some of the particular practices that are maybe important to you and to your traditions, but I just want to give each of you a chance, if you want to speak to that maybe a little bit further, whether for you personally or more broadly for your tradition. What are maybe one or two spiritual practices or disciplines that are most significant for you, and give us a sense of what those are, what they've meant for you. Josh, you want to start?
I'm trying to narrow it down to one or two that have been, I think it goes in seasons of life. I know in my 20s, a big part of my work was working with homeless veterans in Detroit. Detroit has a huge veteran homeless population. That's a story for another day, but man, some of the closest connections to the spirit that I've ever felt were in those situations of vulnerability and serving, but also being served. That's probably the one that came to me first. And I think regular interaction with people who are vulnerable physically, socially, spiritually. Vulnerability takes a lot of different forms. But I do think that brings out our best, our full humanity.
Shayna, what would you say to that?
I'd agree that it's hard to limit it. I think in my tradition, sanctifying time, right? Whether it's the Sabbath, and sort of restricting behavior, if people choose to do that, but making something unique, sort of pausing for a moment. One of my favorite books is don't just do something, sit there, right? We normally say the opposite. Don't just sit there, do something. It's the opposite. It's paying more attention to creating that sacred time, and those shifts in attitude that, like you mentioned with the changing of the diapers, that what prayer or those moments, understanding those little moments can do is elevate them, right? Understanding, that it's not a distraction, but an opportunity. And so I think adding those small moments of prayer. One of our congregants has a beautiful tradition of waking up with their children, and they say, Zeh hayom asa Adonai nagila v'nismecha bo. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us be joyful and let us be glad and rejoice in it. And they say every day. That's what they say. They wake up. And so it's a shift in an attitude. But I agree with Josh. I think those moments where you can see goodness in the world, especially now, when you can see after the tornado in early May, just the amount of outpouring of love. We saw in North Nashville when we were serving dinner, the people with their car trunks open and just giving stuff away to people to try to help them through those first couple of nights in particular. I think those moments of goodness and acts of justice, I think for me really allow my spirit to be refreshed and allow me to feel connected to other human beings and therefore connected more to God, right? Because I see that goodness when it's so easy to only see the stuff that's bad, that's going on in the world, and to be mired in that, to be able to focus on those good moments and be with people through them. I think that to me is a spiritual practice. That is really something that feeds my soul.
Yes, one spiritual practice just based on two pillars of Sufism. The first pillar is to sanctify the creator, and the second one to be compassionate, merciful towards the creatures. And one practice can achieve these two pillars is fasting and to be hungry. So the idea is to be hungry is a hidden action. No one can know you are hungry. No one knows that you are fasting. This is a very sincere action. And in Islam said, so all actions by Muslim, they have reward for that I can give. But there's one action. So this an action just is a very private reward I can give for believer is fasting, because it's a hidden action. And no one can know that you are fasting unless you say, I'm tired, I'm fasting. But once you control your stomach, once you control your desires and control the mouth, and then you control this, a very important part that of your body, that's I think the container of desires. And then you move towards other people, like you feel others people. When you feel like you are hungry. And Sufi people said, so we are strong as long as we are hungry. We are not strong as long as we are full. So the idea to be hungry is very important in Sufism and a very important practice. And this, like controlling stomach, is something like very important. So we can see, like from the first moment, like we wake up till the end moment, just like thinking what we eat and how we can deal with that. So controlling that's very important. So that's why I think some people maybe don't understand maybe the idea behind, maybe I don't want to like say something here about like, but just like I want to say something about kosher and halal. It's about regulations. And these regulations are very important because it's not about just like regulations, because here you regulate your desires. And no, I don't have access to anything. Okay, so there is an authority access to my stomach. And once you announce that, so then you think about how you can deal with your life. So this is like, it's not an easy part. So some people maybe just neglect that. But this is a very important philosophy behind that. So about controlling stomach, controlling desires, controlling mouth, and controlling, and once you do that, you can be aware of others, like homeless, and be aware of poor, and be aware of vulnerable people, and these people like weak people, and then you'll be compassionate. And this is a practice I think very important in Islam and can achieve and fulfill two pillars: sanctify creator and be merciful towards creature.
I appreciate so much each of you highlighting this connection between your sense as an individual of spirituality and how it is intimately and necessarily connected to your engagement with others in the world, and how spirituality and justice and hospitality and so forth are necessarily linked, contrary to what many of us in the West, the United States, where we tend to abide by this hyper individualistic notion. And certainly that informs many of our senses of spirituality. I appreciate each of you really highlighting that, in fact, there's a different way of thinking about spirituality and how it is necessarily connected to love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. So thank you for highlighting that. At this point, I'm going to open it up to those who are joining us for the call. So for those of you who are not panelists, if you would like to, please feel free to turn on your video at this point. And I'm going to open it up to you to pose questions to our panelists, offer any comments or reflections that you might have. In the interest of time, we have about 15 minutes for this portion. I'm just going to request that, to honor everyone's time, that you keep your comment and or question to be as brief as possible so that we can have a chance to get through everyone's thoughts here, but eager to hear any comments or questions that you might want to offer to our panelists. So you can unmute, share that, and then if you'll just mute your audio once again so we can be sure to hear from them. So opening it up to you all now, please join in the conversation with your questions and or comments.
I would just like to say thank you for the panelists. It's such a rich amount of information, and much more than information, just a desire to communicate these things. And I have a lot to ingest here. We talked a little bit about food and things like that. And there's a lot to think about here. And, you know, I'm not at a school on the mystic stuff. So that was pretty interesting and new to me. So I appreciate that discussion. And just thank you so much for sharing. I've enjoyed this immensely.
I'd say something. I've got 3 daughters who are in their 20s. And right now, I would say they're trying to decide if they really want to do this religion thing. They can see the point in social justice. They can see the point of finding God in everyday life. But they're not so sure they see the point in what we do on Sundays. And I'm coming from the perspective, I continue to think as a Christian that the Eucharist is an important thing. There are things in all the traditions that you do when you gather together that I think are important things. How do you hold that stuff together? That's my question. Every tradition changes diapers, you know, so I'm wondering what is it that we've got?
I think a willingness to not let the routine, in religious practices, not let the routine become fixed. As much as we have fixed traditions, I think being open to wisdom and paying attention to the creative renewal that happens. I think human ingenuity and creativity, I think sometimes we get so fixed in form and not so much in content. I think because of the fixed form, we forget about the content. And I think spirituality can keep our religions from forgetting those experiences that framed our stories. I think religion can help, like I said before, keep spirituality from becoming selfish. And in our tradition, we are very communal minded, right? In order to pray, effectively, we can pray by ourselves, but we're commanded to pray in a quorum of 10, right? So you're forced to be in community, because I think we can't just go off on our own and go on our own spiritual quest and really take part in this world. I think the world is meant to be lived among each other. And I think it gives us, those religions give us our identities and places to belong in order that we might be able to seek from there. So for me, it's foundational, and I think it helps keep us rooted, but only as far as the religion is able to be open enough to allow for that exploration and to allow for the wisdom traditions to come through. That Judaism is a language I speak, but I know it's not the only language, and I think that we have shared expression among that. So I hear you when we have 20% of young adults that are saying that they'd rather be spiritual than religious, that they have no use for organized religion. And we keep saying we are not organized. We're probably the most disorganized religion around. But I think people really want that individualism in light of the difficulties and challenges that organized religion has formed. But I think if the religion itself can offer introspection and renewal in its practices, a little bit of that creativity, I think it allows for the religion to crash under absolutism, right? We can grow and breathe with some of that.
Keith, it's good to see you. It was a pleasant surprise to see you on here. I would, coming out of the Christian narrative, I would say it's the sacraments that make Sunday worth it. Baptisms, the Eucharist. I would say, the way I understand singing and worship, I think singing together in a room full of people, although we're not doing a whole lot of that now because of COVID, but pre-COVID, singing together about something you can't prove is about as ridiculous a notion as you could suggest, right? And that's sacramental to me. But I understand the frustration and I understand the sentiment of kind of what's the point. But I think there's something to sacraments. I really do.
I just wanted to say I got so much out of everybody's comments tonight, but one of my favorite parts, and tying in with what Keith was talking about, Rabbi, I wanted to thank you for the comparison of religion and spirit being the tree and the sap. A tree without the sap is dead, and a sap without the tree is sort of formless and maybe not all it could be. So
I do want to give credit. That is actually Rabbi Rami Shapiro who taught me that. So I would love to claim it as my own, but it really does come from him.
Thank you for passing it along. So that really was a special insight for me. Appreciate that.
Isam, is there something that you would say to Keith's question about the things that keep you and other Muslims tethered to religion, not just spirituality?
Yes. So if I understand the question correctly, Keith, please correct me if I don't understand your question. But so in Sufism and spirituality of Islam, nothing can be done without religion. Why? Because religion and Islam represent God, and God here beyond the idea what we understand. So like in Quran, so the debate between Jesus and his people, and especially his followers and his community, he said, let us worship Allah, and Allah here beyond my Lord and your Lord. So this like something like beyond our imagination of God. So when Jesus said that in Quran, so that means, so there is an authority. There is an authority, you just give this authority to him. And when you give this authority to him, then you need to manage how you understand the text. The problem now, how congregation, mosque, church built, and how they build this authority. So because we have a chaos and we have some ruined and corrupted, maybe some sacred places, people just seek the knowledge or seek their journey outside of these places. So my family here, sometimes I struggle where I go, where I should go. Here, should I go to this mosque or that mosque or where? And how I keep my kids safe from a bad education. It's not easy. So, and how you can correct teachings like coming from mosque or coming from church. So now you need to take your kids to the mosque, and then you feel like yourself, you need to correct. Not that's just like, yes, that's right. No, you need to correct. This is a big problem. It's not easy. How you can correct that teaching that's happening in these congregations. So now the problem is how we can approach to that religion, how we can give this authority. Yes, this authority, and this just like to remove and to get rid of our egoism. But then how we can build this authority. So authority in Tasawwuf is completely like different from what we see here. As I said, there are two pillars: to apply all regulations and rule on yourself and not to pose that on others. And then just deal with others based on excuse. Maybe they have this, maybe they have this excuse, but not to pose that on them and not to force others. But in yourself, you are different. You are just like following the discipline. And I don't know if just like just like I talked a lot, but let me know if I understand your question correctly.
No, I appreciate that. And you spoke a little while ago about fasting and the spiritual experience that comes with that. And that's kind of the kind of thing I'm thinking about, where one of the things that you do as a community also connects with the spiritual quest. So I can relate to that. I can see how that would be the case. It is harder to think about my own tradition, maybe.
I'm also thinking too, Assam, you mentioned this sort of central notion of melting, this idea of the things that ought to be sort of to melt away, and namely egoism, right? The sense that your ego is melted away the more that you reflect the image of the divine that you bear. And I know for me, this is something that tethers me to traditions and to faith beyond just spirituality, is that I think I'm doing a lot better in that melting process of the ego until I get in community. And then I realize that there's a whole lot more melting that needs to happen. And that can only be made true and real and aware to me when I'm in community with other people. And that disallows me this notion of sort of an independent spirituality isolated from others and community. So
I think also, I don't want to let it go unsaid that I think you could be religious without being spiritual. I think you have a lot of people that can do the form of religion very well. But that sense of connectedness and that inner soul, or the idea of God's breath or the divine spark in every human being, that is not part of that that expression. So I think it can go, you can be both and or neither. And so I think sometimes it's the thing that turns people off sometimes is the religion without the spirituality.
Yeah. And the rabbis and the pastors can spot that a mile away because they destroy community, right? I think it's Mark Twain who said that, he's religious in the worst sense of the word.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
it's that death, control. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the resistance to religion is really resistance to bad religion, right? Or religion done poorly.
Yeah, I appreciate you all naming that. Absolutely. We've got a couple minutes left. So any further comments or questions that you all want to pose to our panelists?
I have a question, if I may.
You may.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you, friends. Thank you for sharing. I think a couple of you, Josh, and others have alluded to the fact that maybe religion can play a role in community that some don't appreciate as much as others. And my interest is building community in Middle Tennessee, where we're very diverse, and religion has not always played a unifying role. And so is spirituality, however way is tied closely or not, what we can look to, and how would it relate to building that community where we all can exist for who we are? How does spirituality respond to that need in our communities? Thank you.
This is a very big question that cannot be answered in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. This need another panel. So just I want to say something about this question, because I just told Mallory I need to leave at 8:30. I'm sorry for that. But I think like this is a very, very important question, because when we speaking about spirituality, we need to think about what's the implication and how we can fulfill this very important aspect. And so like speaking about community, speaking about single religious community like Muslims, Christian, Jewish, others, or speaking about a broad community and how we can build a very rich, flourished community. This is a very important topic, and that I think this should be ongoing discussion. It's about how we can build a good city, a great city, because all of these principles, foundations, and I think can be applied. I think we share a lot here. So many things shared here, like what Shaina said, Josh said. I think there are many things we can build and many things we can implement in this society, and we can go and just like support these weak people and homeless, and be merciful towards others, and be under the need of these weak societies and vulnerable societies. But everything coming, like as I said to Keith, is nothing can be done without also religion. So we need to be aware about our religions. So social justice cannot be built outside of these regulations. So what's your goal? What's your objective? Because if you don't do that, you will be non-systematic, and you will be in a chaos. So support these and not support others. And why? Why you support these and not support others? Why you have like use spirituality as a strategy? Spirituality is not strategy. Spirituality is real life. Is about how you live with it. So once you live with it, and then you can move with others. What we are talking here about is not about a strategy. It's not just like to have audience smiles and okay, that's good. No, this how we need to think about that. How we can reflect on that in our inner discourse, in our inner mosque, in our inner congregation, and we need to see that. So, and I think this is something it's a very important question, and I cannot stop thinking and reflecting on this question and how we can build. So just like when you ask this question, my mind going back to medieval times when Ibn Hud teaching Maimonides to his followers, and Ibn Hud, a Muslim scholar, teaching Maimonides that time, in a very important circle. So how we can do that in Nashville? So we need to be in the quest of knowledge. We are in the time of knowledge. And I don't know how like people still like living in this like dark time and just like talking about Islam or talking about Judaism and Christianity. I don't know, I don't understand of this like these people. Like we are in a different time, everything opened, library opened. We have very good universities. We need to sit on the table and just talking about knowledge, not talking about you are right and wrong and you are unbelievers and infidel and unbeliever. No, we are in the time of knowledge. And once we build our knowledge, we build our community. Once we have one discourse, one clear discourse in our congregation, in every place, and systematic discourse, then we can build this community. I'm sorry to just like to talk a lot, and
Very good, very good. And I see Dr. Issam has to leave in about 30 seconds, but
yeah, for prayer, David, you did it.
Yes, I did it. I did it.
I have just 5 minutes for prayer, and I'm sorry to leave. So
I
just
just wanted to bring up very quickly in terms of spirituality in Islam, the concept of taqwa,
yes, right,
dhikr Allah,
right.
and dua, all of which are important spiritual concepts in Islam.
Right, and my definition for this word taqwa is this shared word with Hebrew, and we can find in Hebrew lexicon and same root. Taqwa is to be aware of God and then to have balance between inward and outward. And once you do that, so then you don't use spirituality as a strategy. It is not is a real life, is suffering, is to put yourself on trial. Please excuse me, and I need to leave, and that's very great. If you are like the discussion just like going on, maybe I'll be back maybe just 2 minutes or 3 minutes.
Certainly, we understand and respect that, Issam. Thank you. Josh and Shane, I want to give you a chance if there's any final words that you want to share before I close up our time together tonight.
I appreciate Daoud's question and Issam's response to that, because I do think that there is a chance for the community building, and there's something that religion and religions can do that independent seekers in spirituality can't do alone, is that great social progress, right? If you're focused on your own spiritual development without the context or the community of those religious faiths, it's harder to find those like-minded people who can be both, spiritual and skeptical, but also ethical and kind and want to make that social progress. And so I think that the way to do that is to recognize that those similarities in our different traditions that allow us to look beyond the differences, appreciate them, but look beyond them to find that where we can achieve those that level of growth and that social progress and act for that force of good, right? I think that we can see the power and the influence, more so the influence that we can have in community and in those partnerships, especially like what Issam was mentioning back in the Middle Ages, that there are those chances that we can do that again to create real community with a deeper sense of awareness, not independent groups of religions coexisting in the same place, but really interacting and living among one another. And those shared traditions, that the wisdom that comes from each of our traditions, really bolstering and supporting that kind of work. I appreciate that.
The last thing I'll say is I'm an avid believer in the spirit of reciprocity and mutuality, and that is I don't think it's fair for American Christians to criticize how Coptics are treated in Egypt and tolerate the way Muslims are treated in America. And I think Jesus, Leviticus talks about this, but Jesus certainly talks about this, that there is a burden on the majority culture, especially the dominant religion in Nashville being Protestant. I think there's a tremendous responsibility for Protestant Christians in Nashville to make sure that the way we are doing religion is good news for everybody, not just for the adherents of our Protestant doctrines and dogmas. And if it's not good news at some level for everybody, and by that I mean allowing for the flourishing of all people, immigration, literacy rates, healthcare, Shalom health ministries, access, then we're making a farce of all the prophets and everything that Jesus stood for. So that's one of the reasons I agreed to serve on FCC's board. Is it is as a Protestant Christian, is my responsibility to work for the flourishing of everyone who lives. And to Daoud's point, this is not 1960s Middle Tennessee anymore. We've become a diverse, legitimate, urban, suburban center. And the work is hard, but it's also very rewarding and beautiful.
Indeed. Well, Thank you so much to each of you. I'm certain that for those of us joining that there are other comments and questions that you want to make. And so to honor everyone's time, I'm going to conclude now, but I do want to make sure that you know, you have my email address as I've been sending you emails and confirmations. If there's a comment or question that you wanted to direct to one of the panelists that you weren't able to do tonight, please feel free to send that to me, and I'm happy to get that to them and they can respond to you, as I'm sure they're willing to do. But thank you. On behalf of FCC, thank you to Josh, Shana, and Assam for taking your time tonight to offering, in a very sacred way, offering us your insight, your traditions, opening your traditions up to us, and the ways that you have come to understand them and how you have been formed by them. We're honored that you have chosen to do that for and with us. So thank you. To those of you who have joined us tonight, we're so honored that you've shared this evening with us. I hope you'll continue to join us over the next few months as we engage in this table talk series. We miss being able to gather in person around tables, and I'm really grateful that we're able to come to this sort of virtual table together and have this kind of conversation, to the ends that all of you have just spoken to, this way of bringing people together so that indeed all are able to flourish regardless of their traditions and senses of spirituality and what that looks like, but that we can contribute together across those lines for the flourishing of all. I hope that this conversation has been a contribution towards that end, and that's been your experience of it. Please join us for the other table talks. If you have ideas about topics you'd like us to explore maybe in a future series, please send those my way as well. Happy to receive those from each of you. Thank you again to our panelists. Honored to be with you all tonight. Take care, and we'll see you back again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.